Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed we do,
Woo.
guys. It's a big one today. I'm sure that you all probably already know that a draft opinion was leaked, which indicates that the Supreme Court is, in fact, planning to overturn Roe versus Wade. This is obviously a tremendous, earth-shaking moment in terms of American politics. We will cover that from all angles, tell you what exactly was leaked, what it says about the leak itself, and also our own analysis based on polling and based on history of what we think this means for the political landscape. Of course, it's really anyone's guess, but there's no doubt that this is really, a huge, earth-shattering type of moment in politics. But that's not all. We also had the second Amazon labor union election yesterday on Staten Island. They went down to defeat. We'll tell you about that and maybe some reasons why potentially this time was different than last time and what it portends for the future. And, oh, by the way, it's also a big primary day. We have some big races in Ohio with implications for the future of the Republican Party and also the future of the Democratic Party. We're going to have a report from Jordan Chariton, our great partner who is on the ground in Ohio right now with Status Quo. He's got sound both from the Nina Turner-Shontel Brown race. He's also got sound from Republicans talking about how they're evaluating their options there. Some really interesting stuff, so we'll talk to Jordan about what the mood is there. But we want to start with what is obviously truly bombshell news, the leak of this draft decision that would overturn longstanding precedent of Roe versus Wade. Politico with what is, scoop of the ages here. Go ahead and put this up on the screen. I'm going to take my time and go through a good bit of this so you just have the facts of what happened and what the decision, the draft decision here ultimately says. They say, the Supreme Court has voted to strike down the landmark Roe versus Wade decision according to an initial draft majority opinion written by Justice Samuel Alito, circulated inside the court, and obtained by Politico. The draft opinion is a full-throated, unflinching repudiation of the 1973 decision which guaranteed federal constitutional protections of abortion rights and a subsequent 92 decision, that's Planned Parenthood v. Casey, that largely maintained the right. Alito writes, Roe was egregiously wrong from the start. So not mincing words here whatsoever. Part of what he writes in the document, he says, we hold that Roe and Casey must be overruled. It is time to heed the Constitution and return the issue of abortion to the people's elected representatives. Now, they go on to say, deliberations on controversial cases can be fluid. Justices can and sometimes do change their votes as draft opinions circulate, and major decisions can be subject to multiple drafts and vote trading, sometimes until just days before a decision is unveiled. The court's holding will not be final until it is published, likely in the next 2 months. I would say, though, it is very unlikely that the contours of what is happening here are ultimately going to change. They say the immediate impact of the ruling as drafted in February, that's the date that is on this draft that was leaked, would be to end a half-century guarantee of federal constitutional protection of abortion rights and allow each state to decide whether to restrict or ban abortion. It is unclear if there have been subsequent changes to the draft. Let me read you a little bit of the sort of, the TLDR of this lengthy draft. Alito writes, Roe was egregiously wrong from the start. Its reasoning was exceptionally weak, and the decision has had damaging consequences. And far from bringing about a national settlement of the abortion issue, Roe and Casey have inflamed debate and deepened division. Of course, I don't think that this decision is going to lessen debate or lessen divisions, but we'll put that aside. In terms of who is siding with the majority here, we know Thomas, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, and Alito, who drafted this decision. It's a little bit unsure what Chief Justice John Roberts is ultimately going to do. However, there is reporting that indicates he was going to dissent from the majority opinion and take kind of a middle ground, Saagar, which was, this was all came about because of this Mississippi law that banned abortion after 15 weeks. So he was trying to find a way, and you could hear this in the oral arguments too, where he could uphold the Mississippi law and yet not strike down Roe entirely. And so even though, it was very clear, the court is very conservative at this point, it's very clear that there has been decades worth of activism to get justices on the court for exactly this moment, there was a thought maybe they would pursue that middle ground of continuing to erode abortion rights, which has been the direction of the court for years and years now, but not actually go the full distance and overturn Roe. It looks like the only justice who will ultimately pursue that course here is likely Chief Justice John Roberts. So it really is an extraordinary moment. A couple more things within the legal reasoning here that are going to be major points of contention. Liberals are looking at this not just in terms of what it means for Roe, which obviously, has extraordinary consequences. We'll get to some of that in just a moment. But also what it could mean for some other decisions which have been taken by the court, which depend on some of the same legal rationale that Roe ultimately did. So they write in this political piece, liberal justices seem likely to take issue with Alito's assertion in the draft opinion that overturning Roe would not jeopardize other rights the courts have granted in privacy, such as the right to contraception, to engage in private consensual sexual activity, and to marry someone of the same sex. So in particular, liberals are concerned about the Obergefell ruling. That's the one that granted the right to same-sex marriages. There are others as well that sort of depended on some of the same legal rationale. So it truly is an extraordinary moment in how it happened, in when it happened, in what it means, and there is a lot to take in and a lot to process here today.
Yeah, there's no way around it. So I think we can at least say within that, so within the vote itself, we know then that that means that Justices Alito, Kavanaugh, Thomas, Barrett joined the decision. Now, obviously Alito,
Gorsuch,
since he's the person who, and of course, Justice Gorsuch as well. There were some questions on Justice Gorsuch given his ruling in the Bostock case, but that was more on a libertarian-minded view whenever it came to trans issues. So this one at least pushes that in that vein. In terms of Justice Roberts, like you said, we do have reporting. It's difficult, in terms of people familiar with thinking and all of this. We'll get to this in the leak section of our show, but relying on all of these reports when we don't actually know the vote actually makes it even harder. And another thing I would emphasize is this is a draft report. As you said, it is possible that things have moved around. So from a lot of the legal analyses that I have looked at, and from my friends who are certain, is that the vote is almost certainly not likely to change. However, it could be that the opinion and the scope of the opinion could change somewhat whenever it's eventually issued. So this was not expected until July. Now, there's also a lot of questions here about what exactly the court is going to do. They could come out today and just be like, okay, here's a majority opinion. They may, the dissents and all that are still being written, but, given the extraordinary leak of what's happened here, we're just going to go ahead and make this, which would make it settled law.
They have not responded or commented at all to this point.
Right, and that's another point where both pro-life people and people who are pro-choice are saying is like, hey, this is a draft opinion. The law of the land is still what it is. So this does not affect current laws that are on the books. That being said, when it is issued, it will have a significant impact and definitely just change the scope of our politics. Put this up there on the screen. There are 21 states currently that have auto-trigger laws that either ban or restrict abortion if Roe versus Wade is overturned. So there are a lot of laws on the books, and I'll just go ahead and read these. Most would ban abortion with limited exceptions like medical emergencies or in the cases of rape or incest. Those are Arkansas, Idaho, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, and Utah. So those were all laws which were actually enacted mostly during the Trump administration as the ability. So that way the state legislatures would not have to meet in order to ban abortion if they wanted to. It was like an auto-trigger law in the event of what happened with Roe versus Wade. Now, there are other states which have some which will clear certain types of restrictions. So those states, trigger law states, would choose to immediately begin enforcement. Other states would have a so-called phase-in period with the heartbeat laws that we've seen. So it's very, very different in terms of state by state.
Sure.
And then I believe others also have, Oregon, Vermont, and the District of Columbia have it specifically enshrined all the way up until the point of birth. So that is just the clear kind of, now it's going to become a state issue, if and when this does actually become the law of the land. And I think that people need to adjust how they're going to look at these types of politics, because it's just going to change. The state legislatures themselves are going to become major flashpoints. And I think my question and your question as well is like, how does this change the landscape in a state like a Pennsylvania, in a state like a Florida, in a state like what are some other purple states that are? Georgia actually is one that could possibly go more red as a result of this. We'll get to the politics.
Georgia actually has already, they have a very extreme ban already on the books starting at 6 weeks.
Right.
So 6 week after that, you're done. I mean, for any of you who have been pregnant before, you often don't even know till around 6 weeks. So, Georgia now being a purple state, I think, that could probably push the state more in the direction of, a hardening sort of suburban Democratic majority. But we'll get to a little bit more of that because we're going to delve into the politics here in a few minutes. The reason why it's a little bit complex, and you'll see slightly different numbers in different places about which states will effectively automatically ban or severely restrict abortion when this ruling does go into effect, is because, the laws are complex. So you have some states that it's just straight out. They, passed a law that says if Roe gets overturned, we are automatically, these are called trigger bans, so we are automatically effectively ending the right to abortion in our state, period. You have some states, there's a new one added to the list since actually that article was even written, that's Florida, where they passed a law that was very similar, and DeSantis signed it into law, to the Mississippi law that was in front of the court. It is a 15-week ban with exceptions only for life of the mother, but not for rape or incest. You have some states that had, prior to Roe, an abortion ban that was already pre-existing and on the books, and then Roe went into effect and effectively nullified those laws, but the laws are still on the books. So, for some of those are likely to come back into effect. As you pointed out, some places it will happen immediately. Some places there will be a phase-in over time. And I also think it's worth pointing out that because of the way that abortion rights have been the ground has already eroded under abortion rights over the past decades, you already have a number of red states where the right is already effectively gone.
Texas is a good example.
Texas is a good example. Kentucky, where I used to live, is a good example. When I was there, I think there was one clinic that remained in the state. That clinic was constantly under assault from Republicans who tried to pass these laws that were like putting out all of these superfluous medical restrictions that weren't really necessary for the clinics but made it impossible for them to continue to operate. So there are already a number of states where the right is already effectively gone. I read a New York Times analysis this morning that was pretty interesting in terms of estimating what the overall impact of overturning Roe is likely to be. And what they found is in Texas, after their new law went into effect, abortions dropped by about 10%. Because you had women who had the means, at least, who were able to travel across state lines. You had others who were able to get abortion pills in the mail. They estimate that this overturning of Roe would probably reduce abortions by about 14% because it's more sweeping in scope. They also point out, which I think is always important to remember, who is the most typical patient seeking an abortion. It's usually low-income women. So there is no doubt, just factually, that this ruling will overwhelmingly impact poor and working class women, wealthy women in this country, pre-Roe, post-Roe, and after this new overturning of Roe happens, have always been able to get whatever care, whatever doctors, whatever access, whatever procedures they want to get. That will undoubtedly still be the case. It's poor and working class women who will be affected by this. They are the typical abortion patients. And it's also worth pointing out here that the typical woman seeking an abortion is a mother who already has children. So listen, my personal feelings on this, I am a mother. I know that there are people who watch this show who have any range of views on the issue.
Yeah.
I do think it's, disingenuous to say that the moral issues involved are not complex or that there are not competing moral claims here. Personally, I have always felt that because it is a complex moral issue, the best course for governments to take is to trust the women who are evaluating a very difficult landscape and making very difficult choices. So that's why I've always been pro-choice and why I do, think that this decision ultimately will be really damaging for a lot of women out there. And the last thing I'll say on this, on my own personal opinion, is that if you do care, and I do, and I know probably all of you listening do as well, about reducing the number of abortions, because no one is like, yay, go abortion, abortion is a wonderful thing, you can look at the statistics and see that the vast majority of women who seek abortions are low income, and see that, hey, if you deal with material conditions and you allow women to be able to support their children and their families and create an atmosphere of thriving, then you are going to have a very large effect in terms of reducing abortions.
Yeah.
So that's what I'll say about that.
It's funny, Krystal. I've said previously I'd rather gouge my eyes out than talk about abortion, but I guess it's here, so cards on the table.
Yeah.
Here it is. I grew up in evangelical Texas, left a bit of a scar on me. I can just tell you personally, I consider myself a barstool conservative. I'm culturally center-right whenever it comes to modern culture war issues, but I've always been safe, legal, and rare guy, basically a Democrat from the 1990s. I mean, what you just espoused is literally what Bill Clinton said on the 1992 Democratic nomination. I know that's going to piss off a lot of my Republican and Catholic friends here in Washington, but look, I mean, I think I owe it to the audience to tell people where I'm coming from. So if you are a person who is super pro-life and you're Catholic or evangelical or somebody else, or Orthodox Jewish, etc., I am not going to be your representative on this issue. And I just think it's important for people to understand where I'm coming from. I do think some of the histrionics on this are wrong. I mean, for example, what you were talking about, I know several states, New York, California, and elsewhere, are going to set up travel funds so that people who are in these places can travel to those states. I think that's very likely to be, the next frontier of a lot of abortion politics. But yeah, I mean, look, I mostly share your view on the entire thing. I'm pretty socially libertarian and have become so, especially over the last 2 years during the COVID pandemic. And, whenever I look at this issue, I mostly trust people to do what they want for themselves. I do have a real moral aversion to partial birth abortion and anything, I was telling you there's a case here in Washington where there were some released photos of babies who were aborted when they were 7 months old. And I was like, I'm sorry, that's crazy. That's straight up murder. Now, obviously, the Catholics and the Christians are going to be like, well, life begins at conception. Listen, I'm not religious. I don't share your view. I'm never going to. You're not going to convince me of it. I do want to respect, though, the people who feel that way. It's a free country. You're allowed to believe what you would like. And I know this is the number one issue for a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump. I do think, and we'll get to this in the Roe Politics segment, listen, I mean, this is going to have a significant impact on our public discourse. I would just ask you, try and engage it in the way that we're here. Krystal, you just gave an extraordinarily compelling case, in my opinion, on the pro-choice point of view. You could also see clearly why people might be able to dissent from it. Guys, if you are out there, please just spend some time engaging both with the people on both sides and try to understand that they are not demonic and they don't want to destroy you, both on either side. Now, are there fringe elements? Like you said, are there people who like Lena Dunham who literally support and celebrate abortion? Yeah, you can find that, frankly, amongst all people.
Well, you can also find,
and that's what I'm saying.
People who bomb abortion clinics
they're
and
not
will
just exactly
say I'm a murderer for what I just said.
That's right. People will call me a murderer too. I already know that you can hear the screeching. I don't particularly care. But listen, those fringe elements exist on all sides of our debate. I would just say that, let's all try to remember who we are. We've lived through much more contentious times in this country, and I know it's a difficult time for people. I personally felt, and I know this sounds crazy, I felt a sense of dread when I saw the news because I was like, oh man, this is the last thing we need in terms of ripping us all apart. But I also know that there are a lot of Catholic moms and, March for Life people out there. This is their number one issue. They've been trying for this for 40 years. And, it's people have constituencies in this country, and it is what it is.
You can argue that this issue is maybe the most central issue to why Trump ultimately was elected.
Yeah,
because,
that's right.
I mean, it was him putting Mike Pence on the ticket to shore up, to signal to evangelicals, I'm with you.
Yeah.
You may not love my choices in life, and I know in the past he supported Planned Parenthood. I mean, he clearly doesn't really care about the issue, but it doesn't matter what he personally feels, because ultimately he puts Pence on the ticket. He releases his list of Supreme Court justices, and in the wake of the fallout from the grab her by the pussy scandal, that really helped to shore up and bring home that Christian, evangelical base for whom this has been an extremely animating issue for decades. So, and now that base is his hardest support. And to be quite honest, a lot of times we talk about oh, it doesn't make sense. You hear this analysis a lot, why do they love Donald Trump? This is why right here, because ultimately this was the issue, the number one issue that they were backing him for. And now it's actually happening. The last thing I want to say, and then we can move on to how this came out, which is also worth discussing and is also pretty extraordinary, is Alito writes in this draft decision, "We do not pretend to know how our political system or society will respond to today's decision overruling Roe and Casey. And even if we could foresee what will happen, we would have no authority to let that knowledge influence our decision. We can only do our job, which is to interpret the law, apply longstanding principles of stare decisis," I think that's how you say that, "and decide this case accordingly. We therefore hold that the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion. Roe and Casey must be overruled, and the authority to regulate abortion must be returned to the people and their elected representatives." So Alito basically acknowledging here that this is going to be a shit show, that this is going to trigger an incredibly tumultuous time in American politics because, for the majority of the country, we're going to get to the polls. Roe has been sort of settled law. It's accepted. It's very significant majority support. Now, Americans' views on abortion are kind of all over the place. It's complex. Americans by and large are sort of moderate on how they feel about abortion rights. Most people don't think you should have the right all the way up till the date of birth, but they also don't support even in very red states the heartbeat bills that would say the moment that there's a heartbeat, abortion is 100% banned. So this definitely puts the court on the side of a relatively extremist position here. And, it's the first time where instead of just this sort of casual erosion of this right or other things that have been broadly viewed by a large number of people as social progress, where you have an actual clear, the bending of the moral universe doesn't actually always arc towards justice.
Well, it depends how you look at it, right?
Of course, but I'm saying in terms of the majority of the country,
sure.
Based on the polling, right? This is a decision that by the majority of the country has been viewed as progress. For it to be then overturned, I do think that it is a real wake-up call for a lot of people that none of these things can ultimately be taken for granted. None of it is completely settled ground. And that's just my encouragement to you, wherever you fall on this issue or any other on the political spectrum, to not take for granted any privilege, benefit, right that you enjoy in this country. Any and all of it can be rolled back if you are disengaged, if you are apathetic, if you think that you don't want to get your hands dirty in politics, or if you think that you're too disgusted with the system, which I certainly understand and relate to ultimately get involved. So that's sort of the ruling. As I said at the beginning, there is some outside chance that it could change between now and the month or 2 months from now when it ultimately is released and becomes law of the land. But I think that is very, very unlikely. And it seems incredibly, almost certain that this is the direction the country's headed in. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.